Our hearts and our minds are clouded and impaired, handicapped by the fall. We are spiritual, special needs people, quite literally disabled in every possible way. We are, in God's view, a mortal child who was born blind, mentally impaired, and paralyzed. Hello, and welcome to WordWise. I'm your host, Kit, and today we'll be continuing our examination of Visions of Glory, also known as the Mormon Doomsday Prepper Bible. In my first video about this book, we made it through the foreword, the author's note, and a single chapter, and identified four major themes: omniscience, the physical body, specialness, and S. I can't say the real word in the first 8 minutes of the video, or YouTube will age restrict it. I know it drives people crazy. Take your complaints to Google. I'm also going to get a little bit personal today, because as I was researching Tom Harrison, I discovered that he and I have something unexpected in common, and it casts the events in this book in a very different light. By the way, this video is dedicated to my father. Happy birthday, Dither. If you haven't seen my video going over the first chapter of Visions of Glory, I strongly suggest you watch that first. But in case it's been a while, or you just hate beginnings, here's a quick recap. In the first chapter, Spencer had a near-death experience during a medical procedure, and during that near-death experience, he communicated with rocks, desks, and couches, learned about good and evil spirits, and viewed his own conception and birth. He also learned that his mother, who moved in with her ex's parents and worked as a nurse after she was left to raise 3 kids under 5 by herself, never really wanted Spencer, while the alcoholic, bar-owning, vehicular homicide-committing father he never met was the one who truly loved him. Let's jump right into the deep end. Chapter 2, Paradise Lost. After returning from his near-death experience, Spencer's life changed. Before this, my life goal was to advance my career, to become a tenured professor, and to retire by the time I was 50. My goal was to become rich, to become well-known, to write books, and to become famous. I wanted to work in the church, serving in any capacity, working my way up through the priesthood, as I thought of it at that time, proving myself faithful and of service to the Latter-day Church. Following this experience beyond the veil, I spent the next 10 years rearranging my life from egocentric to Christ-centric. Remember in my first video on this book, when I said I thought Spencer was lying to himself about not wanting to be famous? Well, I was almost right. It turns out he tried to stuff down his desire to be famous because he thought that's what God wanted him to do. The author says that Spencer changed his life from egocentric to Christ-centric, but doesn't explain what changes he made. In fact, the author specifies that Spencer went ahead and finished his education, which I assume refers to the PhD program that the first chapter said he was enrolled in, but I can't find any evidence that Tom Harrison did so. His LinkedIn page only lists 2 master's degrees, and I've never heard him referred to as Dr. Harrison. I initially assumed this was an issue caused by a typo, but then I came across something that made me suspect that Tom Harrison deliberately decided to mislead the reader, and possibly John Pontius. We'll get to that shortly. The author writes that after the NDE, the door to heaven didn't close completely, which sounds a lot like Chad Daybell claiming his veil was torn. So Spencer's psychic powers remained. After this life-altering experience, I began getting information from God to give to my clients. I would, upon occasion, have to wait for them to stop talking so that I could tell them what I had just learned. Over time, as I became more sensitive to spiritual things and more obedient in my response to them, my discernment improved. My insight into their lives improved. I sometimes saw in vision the things that had happened to these clients, and my compassion and understanding was great for them. This type of behavior is unethical for a therapist, obviously. It isn't a therapist's job to be a medium, and that's not why people go to them. And Spencer's behavior is unethical even if you believe that he has psychic powers, because it also isn't a therapist's job to go behind their client's back and gather information about them, and I don't see how the fact that God's the one spilling the tea changes that. Plus, Spencer was working with children. Did their parents know that the kids were being given messages from God by the man who was supposed to be giving them therapy? I find it very weird that he said he would have to wait for his clients to stop talking. That's what they came there to do. Have you ever heard someone say that if you're thinking about what you're going to say next while someone else is talking, you aren't really listening to them? Was Spencer really listening to these kids, or was he too busy focusing on hearing messages from God? I feel like he was trying to make therapy more about himself. Like, was he bored while listening to his patients, so he decided to try to create interest for himself by adding this mystical layer? Was he trying to blow people away with his impossible insight? What was the payoff for him doing this? And ethics aside, what if he was wrong? What if he wasn't talking to God? What if it was his imagination? What if he was hallucinating? What if the messages were from Satan? And what if the information was incorrect? I have so many issues with this, and I don't want to spend forever on this single paragraph, but it's a parade of red flags. The belief that his astral omniscience spilled over into his real life is a serious concern, especially given the profession he was in. Another significant thing I learned was that we are never alone. Angels are always present, both good and evil. I also realized that by my behavior, mood, or thoughts, I was in control of who was in the room with me. I used to feel negative feelings or emotions and feel overpowered by them. I was startled to realize that I was dealing with dark spirits who overwhelmed me when I gave them permission by my emotions. I realized I was in control, and I worked hard to remain positive and loving, to invite divine beings into my life who uplifted me and those around me. It is a tenet of my faith now that for good or evil, we are never alone. I don't like this line of thinking. The author, and Spencer, I guess, buys into the idea that our thoughts dictate our reality. That is just scientifically false. Ask anyone who made a vision board in the early 2000s. Speaking of which, here is a random but fun connection. The Secret was essentially a ripoff of Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich. Napoleon Hill, in addition to being a career con man, was a spiritual con man who claimed to have been visited by the Ascended Masters. The Ascended Masters are a group of spiritually evolved teachers, including imaginary versions of Jesus and Saint Germain, and the first person to describe interacting with them and receiving spiritual wisdom from them was Madame Blavatsky. What else did Madame Blavatsky invent? Her writing includes the first appearance of the phrase, the law of attraction, which is the basis of The Secret. All of these spiritual con artists are connected, and I don't mean in a conspiracy, I mean they're constantly ripping each other off, which, for reasons I don't understand, seems to increase their credibility in some people's eyes. The next excerpt I want to share begins with the words, before this time. I'm not sure to what time that refers. It isn't entirely clear from the context, but my best guess is that the author means prior to the near-death experience. If that's true, though, it raises some questions. Before this time, I had worked in a large hospital with children suffering from cancer. There were times when I would see with spiritual eyes an angelic intervention to lengthen the child's life and knew it would happen. These times resulted in cures that could only be miracles of God. Upon occasion, I also realized that a child's life was at an end and they had completed their mortal work. The child would pass away shortly thereafter. If my guess is right, and he was able to determine who would live and who would die before the NDE, why didn't we hear about that? There's a line in the foreword in which John Pontius says that Spencer had been having visions since his early 20s, and we know that NDE happened when he was 33. It's starting to sound like maybe things didn't change that much after the NDE. Like maybe Spencer had been doing this kind of thing for years already, and this inconsistency is going to come up again. What we're seeing here with these sick children, though, is more of Spencer's omniscience coming out. Now he knows who's going to live or die. The author finally comes around to the question of what kind of changes Spencer made after his NDE. Like everything else, it raises more questions than it answers. After this out-of-body experience, my life went through a long and difficult evolution, especially when you consider that such decisions were not entirely mine, because these were my wife's and family's dreams as well. I had instilled my dreams into them for years, and now I was faced with trying to teach them why I had changed my life and my goals. These changes were not accomplished without resistance. Besides my family, almost all of my colleagues, fellow professors, and peers at the universities, even those who had mentored and advanced me at the universities, all resisted the changes I was making. Some of them viewed me as self-destructive, others viewed me as just stupid. There were even a few who told me that I had suffered a mental or emotional breakdown. At the end of the paragraph, the author writes, "I left several of my hospital tenures, retired from several university appointments, and focused on my private practice." So something's not lining up here. He finished his education and decided to focus on a career in private practice. Why would that lead others to accuse him of being self-destructive or of having had a nervous breakdown? Plenty of people with PhDs go into private practice. That's not a crazy thing to do. That's just a career choice. It might have meant less money than a university position, but it certainly would have paid enough for him to support his family. So how is that wrecking his wife and his family's dreams? I feel strongly that something else was going on here that the author isn't delving into. I don't know what it was, but I keep coming back to the PhD thing. A terminal degree is the highest university degree available in a given field. That's usually a master's degree or a PhD, and having one is almost always a requirement for a university teaching position. For the field of psychology, the terminal degree is a PhD. If Pontius was right that Spencer was in a PhD program at the time of his near-death experience, and then he quit the program or failed out, that would explain why he retired from his university appointments. He may have been teaching as a grad student and was no longer considered qualified. Now, would that have led people to accuse him of being self-destructive? I don't know. My mother was a university professor before she retired, and 75% of the students in her PhD program quit before they finished. Now, it was the top-rated program in her field, but even so, this is something that happens. People don't finish. PhD programs are tough, and they take a long time. I'm skeptical that people would have accused Spencer of having had a nervous breakdown just because he decided to be happy with his master's and focus on treating clients. Something else had to be going on for them to come to that conclusion. The author then swings back in the other direction and returns to the idea of people thinking their problems away. The author supplies a long list of physical illnesses from which Spencer suffered. And I'm going to go off on a tangent for a moment because it turns out that Spencer and I have more in common than you might think. Certainly more than I expected. I was Googling Tom Harrison, and 2 videos came up of him giving talks at the Bateman Horne Center in Utah, which is a medical center specializing in myalgic encephalomyelitis, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia. Tom Harrison was diagnosed with myalgic encephalomyelitis in 1989, according to his talk. Coincidentally, I happen to have been diagnosed with that condition back in 2005, and I want to talk about it for a minute, because knowing that Tom Harrison is dealing with it casts a very different light on the events in this book. There are 2 things to understand about chronic fatigue syndrome. Actually, myalgic encephalomyelitis is the preferred name, but it's a mouthful, so let's just call it ME. The first thing to understand about ME is that it's a neurological illness that can affect every system in the body. If your brain can mess it up, ME can cause dysfunction. Debilitating fatigue is the primary symptom, and it can come on suddenly after exertion. But it also wrecks the immune system, it causes brain fog and organ issues, and it does something to sleep that makes it completely unrefreshing. It's often, but not always, comorbid with fibromyalgia, and a lot of people consider them 2 variants of the same illness, but no one has ever found the root cause of either. In fact, long COVID appears to be a version of ME, and even though the government increased research funding by 8,000%, they still can't find the cause. The other thing to understand about ME is that it was the subject of a 30-year medical gaslighting scandal that patients are still dealing with. ME is triggered by a medical event, usually a viral or bacterial infection, but sometimes by physical trauma or even hormone changes like menopause. Years ago, a group of psychiatrists decided it was psychological in origin. I'm not sure why they decided this, other than because no one had been able to identify the cause, and because 75% of people who get ME are female, and a large proportion of the medical field still believes in female hysteria. But they came up with this theory, and then they falsified data to convince the medical industry that they were right, and that people with ME just needed CBT and graded exercise therapy. The CBT didn't work, and the graded exercise therapy more often than not caused people to get worse. Some patients lost the ability to walk, to care for themselves, and a few died because of this treatment protocol. I will link an excellent video below. It was made by an ME patient. I don't know where he found the energy to do it because he is currently not very functional. He could really use your support, and it's just a super well-made video that explains all of this in better detail. Mine was a very typical case of ME. I got mono my last semester of college and just never got better. 6 months after graduation, I was sleeping 18 hours a day. I've slowly improved over the last 2 decades, but it's unlikely I'll ever be cured. So mostly the last 20 years have been a process of learning to live with this. I'm talking about my own experience with ME because I want to be clear that I have both a lot of experience with this illness, I know a lot about it, and I have immense compassion for Tom Harrison. I know what a hard illness ME is. I know it firsthand. I live with it every day. I was going to record this video yesterday, but instead I woke up with a migraine and my fibro was flaring, and I spent the day on the couch and the evening in a hot bath. And that happens about once a week for me. It used to be 3 or 4 days a week. So I know how tough life has been for Tom Harrison. I get it. I remember when I was diagnosed, I was told that having mono had given me a fear of exercise, and I just needed to push myself harder. And I remember being so confused because I was dying to exercise. I grew up in competitive gymnastics, and after that it was track and tennis and ice skating, and I took 5 kinds of dance in college. It didn't really make sense to me that being sick for a month could have wiped out 20 years of jockdom. But I went and saw a therapist for CBT, and luckily I found a physical therapist who specialized in fibromyalgia patients and knew that the prevailing treatment advice wasn't working, and she taught me more about how to actually deal with fibromyalgia than any other medical professional ever has. The CBT was somewhat useful. I think everybody could benefit from learning basic CBT. And the physical therapy did help a little, but overall, I didn't see much improvement. But the falsified research and the treatment protocol it spawned weren't retracted until 2016. And today, a lot of doctors either haven't heard that, or else they still want to believe ME is psychological. I can't tell you how damaging that is to patients. Losing your job, your social life, your relationships, your ability to take care of yourself, and then being told it's happening because you're scared that exercise will be uncomfortable is medical gaslighting at its finest. And this is a devastating illness. I'm not saying that because I want sympathy or pity. I am blessed to have a support system that allows me to take really good care of myself and a partner and family who understand that I'm ill and not lazy. But that's a privilege most people don't have. And I'm trying to imagine what it was like to be Tom Harrison and have a wife and 5 kids who are all counting on you to support them financially. And you have an illness that no one can really explain. Or worse, you've been told is all in your head. Even though you're a psychologist. That had to be genuinely awful. I'm sure that ate away at his self-esteem in a huge way. It probably wrecked his self-image. It probably made him question his abilities as a psychologist. And I hate that for him. I don't wish that on anyone. That said, the fact that Tom Harrison has ME makes me think about visions of glory differently. For one thing, it makes these medical emergencies he keeps having less mysterious. Most of us with ME have something called mast cell dysfunction, which means we have allergic reactions at the drop of a hat. So it isn't surprising that Spencer had an allergic reaction to IV contrast. He was at heightened risk for that. In this chapter, Spencer is going to have a mysterious medical event in Tahiti that sounds pretty bizarre, unless you have ME and know that suddenly collapsing after not sleeping for 24 hours and then lying in bed sweating with your heart racing just isn't unusual. Post-exertion exhaustion is one of the hallmarks of this illness. You push too hard and then you collapse. That's why telling people that they needed to exercise harder was a terrible idea. Having weird symptoms with no obvious explanation, like sweating and tachycardia, just aren't unusual. And the number of symptoms ME can cause is vast. I remember pushing myself too hard on vacation years ago and having a reaction almost identical to this at the Santa Fe Opera. I shouldn't have stayed till the end, but it was the Santa Fe Opera. I wasn't missing the end of Beatrice and Benedict, no matter how awful I felt. And I ended up shaking and crying and barely able to walk by the time we got back to the hotel. The pain was intense. That's the trade-off of pushing too hard, and Tom Harrison would have been aware of that cycle by the time he went to Tahiti. The author says Spencer can't sleep on planes, so he didn't sleep during the plane ride from Utah to California, and then the one from California to Hawaii, and then another from Hawaii to Tahiti. It is absolutely predictable that he would collapse at the end of that trip. The author presents this as a mysterious medical crisis. It wasn't. But the biggest point I want to make about Tom Harrison having ME is that the author doesn't include it in the book. And I understand why. The book was published in 2012, which was at the height of the ME is all in your head fad. I assume that the author was afraid of admitting Spencer had ME because it would discredit him. And I understand that fear. After all the exercise and physical therapy in the world failed to make me better, I quit telling doctors I had been diagnosed with ME because they become dismissive the moment they hear that. But the omission from the book is hugely problematic, in my opinion. Spencer's health is a major focus of the story, but we aren't hearing the truth about it. He didn't have one medical problem after another pop up. He had a single major illness that caused all of these problems. That's never admitted. And given that the author is going to claim that God sent Spencer the medical problems, I feel it's misleading. Did God send one illness after another to Spencer, plague style, in order to hone his spiritual abilities? Or did Spencer get unlucky once and develop a condition that caused chronic problems? That's a really important distinction when you're interpreting this story. Additionally, Tom Harrison drops some info in his talks about ME that doesn't appear in this book. He put on his LinkedIn page that he had 40 years of experience as a therapist, but in his second ME talk at the Bateman Horn Center, he said that he didn't work for 20 years after he got diagnosed.
It took me 20 years from the time I was diagnosed to the time I really started saying, I think I can go back to work. It took me 20 years to really trust again in that structural function. But I had to learn it. And initially I'd go back and see one patient, and then I would take a nap in my office for an hour, and I would see another patient, and then I'd go.
So which is it? Does he have 20 years of experience or 40? And why isn't this period when he couldn't work ever mentioned in the book? Is that what was really happening when he left his PhD program? Were people telling him that he wasn't really sick and needed to come back to class? Because that I could see as inspiring people to accuse him of having had a nervous breakdown. The second talk he gave, by the way, is bonkers. He seems completely unprepared. He says he didn't bring a PowerPoint because he doesn't know how to use PowerPoint, even though he used a PowerPoint during the first talk he gave. He presents himself as an expert in neurology, but it's clear he has a rudimentary and inaccurate understanding of the science. He says that fertility treatments make a woman less likely to get pregnant. At one point, he talks about a process for effecting change in our lives and claims that the process was invented by Einstein.
Right before Albert Einstein died, he came up with healthy functional creation standards.
I can find no evidence of this. And the process seems more like something he scraped together himself from notes on Brené Brown presentations. He comes across as both bitter and smug, and it's just strange. I will link that video below too. To get back to the text, the author implies that people can think their health problems away, but he doesn't mention that it didn't work for Spencer. It is my present realization that I set myself up for these illnesses by continuing the unhealthy emotional state which I acquired from childhood. I had not yet learned to not let those losses manifest themselves as physical illness. I believe I got ME because I caught mono. It sucks, but it isn't cosmic. But the author, like a lot of religious people, feels the need to ascribe a divine purpose to everything. I understand that urge, the desire to make sense out of something bad that happens to us, and if people can find an understanding that helps them feel that their illness serves a purpose or that provides them comfort, I think that's lovely and worthwhile. The issue comes when you make yourself responsible for your illness. Let's say Spencer pushes too hard one day. His grandkids are visiting, and even though he's tired, he takes them to the zoo. Then he has to spend 3 days in bed recovering. Which lesson should he take from that? That he needs to be more careful with his energy? Or that it's his fault he got sick because he was letting his childhood losses manifest? Which interpretation is more likely to prevent this from happening again in the future? The last and greatest reason for all of these health problems was that I was blessed to have health crises in order to experience physical death multiple times and thus to see these visions. I know now that before I was born, I chose this course for myself. I was glad to be able to choose this path for my life, and although it has been hard and painful and always terrifying, I still feel as if my life has been tremendously blessed because of this process in my life. I wouldn't go back and choose a different path even if I could. If you can find a silver lining in something terrible that happens to you, I say take it. But there's a difference between saying, this crappy thing happened, but at least I learned something from it, and saying, this crappy thing happened so I could learn something from it. The author is confused about the difference between a benefit and a cause. Something in this also smacks of denial to me. It's like the author doesn't want to admit that anything terrible happened to him, even though he describes Spencer's life as always terrifying. I was surprised when watching Tom Harrison's talks about ME that he never discussed the emotional toll of the illness. He talked about practical things like dressing in layers and taking advantage of brain plasticity, but he never talked about mourning or working through anger and disappointment. Those are part of any major or chronic illness, and I would expect a therapist to know that, especially one who claims to specialize in chronically ill patients. 20 years after his first NDE, so approximately 1995, Spencer and his wife's family went on vacation to Tahiti. They flew all the way from Utah to Tahiti, and Spencer didn't sleep the entire time. He and his wife arrived at their little beach bungalow, and he told her he was too tired to go to dinner. As I said earlier, post-exertion malaise is the hallmark of ME, so it isn't at all surprising he would have a crash at that point. Tom Harrison was diagnosed in 1989, so he would have known he had ME for like 6 years by then, and the collapse should have been something he could have anticipated. His wife Lynn went to dinner and left him in the bungalow. While I showered, my heart was racing. I suspected it was just a lack of sleep, I dressed, laid down on the bed, and started sweating profusely. I knew something was wrong now, but there was no phone in the bungalow. I felt a crushing pain in my chest, which just kept getting worse. I was having difficulty breathing and did not have the ability to call for help. Unfortunately, these aren't unusual symptoms of an ME collapse. You push too hard, and then it's like your brain really wants to let you know you've overdone it, and you develop all these sudden, inexplicable symptoms. Your autonomic nervous system just goes nuts, and it's scary, but I've never heard of it being fatal. Most ME-related deaths are due to an increased chance of heart disease, cancer, and self-harm. There have also been cases where people have become too weak to swallow and have wasted away. But I'm unaware of post-exertion malaise causing death. The next thing I recall was that I rose up out of my body and to the ceiling. It felt the same as when I had died 12 years earlier while getting the X-ray contrast, except that this time I rose upward out of my body instead of departing down through the bed. Spencer floats out of his body and then becomes strangely fixated on the idea of dying in a foreign land. He's very worried that his wife won't be able to get his body back to the US. I'm not sure why that's his focus, although the xenophobia we're about to get into might have something to do with it. But his wife, Lynn, returns to the bungalow, and he returns to his body and tells her that he thinks he's dying. She gives him some aspirin, and her father and brother give him a priesthood blessing, and they go back to dinner. Clearly, they didn't think he was dying. As soon as they're gone, Spencer leaves his body again. He floats up to the top of the bungalow where there's a ceiling fan. There were no other spirits to greet me or watch after me. I waited a long time by the fan as I felt increasingly more abandoned and bereft of support. It was disconcerting to me to be in a world I knew was filled with spirit beings and yet to be by myself. I again pleaded with Father to please send a righteous spirit to be with me so that I would not be dead, lost, and alone in this foreign land. A voice came into my spirit as if it entered into my bosom, saying that I needed to go through this darkness to understand that which would be forthcoming in my life. I didn't understand what it meant at that time, but have since been able to understand. God then informs him that it's time for him to learn about evil. The author says that Spencer was so naive and good-hearted, he had no idea that truly bad people existed, which, given his extensive training in psychology, is a bit hard to believe. I had been shown great light, visions of God and angels, and in order to comprehend greater truth and greater light, now I had to understand its opposite, the pure evil side of the equation. All things in mortality and eternity exist in opposites. To comprehend greater and greater light, I had to also comprehend greater darkness. Even Jesus Christ had to descend below all things before he could rise above all things. The same seemed to be true for me, though in a far lesser degree than our Savior, of course. Still, the divine laws that govern these blessings demand the juxtaposition of good and evil, and I had to understand by personal experience. So we're back to comparing Spencer to Jesus. His Tahitian bungalow is now the Garden of Gethsemane. Spencer's wife Lynn and one of her sisters, who's an RN, come in to check on Spencer, conclude that he's sleeping, and leave. Again, the people around Spencer aren't reacting like this is a medical emergency, and that's also common with an ME collapse. At least in my experience, my mom got used to them long before I did, and was able to be the one to say, "We've been through this before, let's get you a Xanax and put you to bed." I think the anxiety is actually a symptom of the collapse, so it makes sense that it's harder for patients to get used to going through it than it is for their family members, who can look at them and say, "I've seen this happen a half dozen times before, and he's always okay in the end." That's just my theory based on personal experience. I have to give a trigger warning now for unbridled racism with colonial overtones. Spencer is shown the history of the ancient Tahitians in a section the author labels "A Diorama of Hell." I don't know where Spencer came up with this, or if the author just went nuts, but I want to be clear that While human sacrifices were performed by the ancient Polynesians, as they were in many cultures, there's no evidence of most of what I'm about to read. I was shown that initially they were an enlightened and spirit-filled people, even innocent and undefiled. They knew about Jesus Christ, his role and his mission, which had come to them from holy men and women who had established their cultural heritage. I saw that their understanding deteriorated over the years as their founders died, and those who believed became fewer in number. They sank to the most gross and graphic form of human mistreatment, debauchery, sexual perversions, and spiritual darkness imaginable. Actually, none of it was imaginable to me. I just saw it and was sickened. In truth, I'm still haunted by the memory of it. Among many other heinous things, they were sacrificing young virgins and killing infants and children in the most awful manner they could devise. It was horrifying to me then and horrifying to me now, because I saw it as it had happened, in great detail. They were doing this in part because of false religion, and in part to avenge themselves of similar atrocities of their enemies. Their minds and hearts and everything they did were saturated by war, revenge, and a lust for everything evil. Maybe Spencer's anxiety over dying in a foreign land led to this dream or fantasy, whatever you want to call it. Maybe it's just a manifestation of his anxiousness, because there's no historical basis for this. I don't even think a society like this could survive. I think it would wipe itself out. The idea that the ancient Tahitians were innocent and undefiled is straight out of the Noble Savage playbook. And what is this nonsense about the ancient Tahitians knowing about Jesus? A big part of the Book of Mormon is the story of how Jesus visited the Americas after his resurrection. Is the author saying he swung by Tahiti too? Because that's a wild claim. Is the author suggesting Jesus went on a post-resurrection world tour? I was distracted by the word founders in this excerpt. Generally, we don't hear about the founders of a civilization because civilizations aren't planned. Even the founding fathers didn't found a civilization, just a country. The author describes ancient Tahiti as if it were a planned civilization. It's such a strange presentation that I almost wonder if this is supposed to be an allegory for America. The idea that the founders knew about Jesus is very in keeping with the alternative history that Tim Ballard loves so much, that America has always been a Christian, even a Mormon nation, but now it's fallen into sin. I could be off, but that was the first thing I thought of. Not only was I seeing the suffering and horrifying pains of those who were being mistreated, but I was seeing evil spirits who were reveling in their pain. These evil spirits were glorying in it and urging the mortals to do worse and worse things, giving them inspiration on how to prolong the suffering of their victims. I don't believe mortals could even think of such evil acts and then forge a society and tradition of such debauchery without the evil spirits urging them and instructing them in not just performing these acts, but in how to also religionize it over many years to make it become traditional and acceptable to their entire society. The whole scene reached such an insane hyper-frenzy of evil that it was frightening to me beyond anything I have ever experienced, before or since. I tried to turn away, but the vision would not leave my eyes. We finally come back to an idea that was seated in chapter 1, which is that when we sin, we open ourselves up to the influence of evil spirits, and those evil spirits took over an entire society, which led to an insane hyper-frenzy of evil. I feel that the use of the word hyper as a modifier for frenzy is ridiculous hyperbole, and I'm afraid I have to blame John Pontius for that one. Spencer prays to God to take this vision from his sight, and he's magically transported, astrally, I guess, from Tahiti to Salt Lake, where a group of journalists has gathered outside the Beehive House, which is a historic residence of Brigham Young. Spencer asks why God is showing him this, and God's response is incredibly contradictory. I again asked God, "What is going on?" He replied, "You are not going to die in Tahiti. However, I will show you that which will surely come to pass." I was told that this vision was a metaphor, a type of things that would shortly happen, not an actual occurrence that I was viewing, or even that it would happen just this way. Which is it? Will these things surely come to pass, or will things like this happen? Why can't God give a straight answer in this story? I feel like this is the author again trying to predict the future without admitting he's predicting the future. Spencer learns, through osmosis, I guess, that the reporters are waiting for word that the current prophet has died. The author says this makes Spencer sad because he and the prophet are friends. Because naturally, Spencer is so special that he's personal friends with the prophet of the church. This prophet was Howard W. Hunter, by the way. He only served as prophet for 9 months, and appears to have spent most of that time working on the anti-LGBTQ proclamation on the family. Spencer goes into the beehive house and enters a bedroom, where he finds his friend the Apostle, who is known to be Neil A. Maxwell, on his knees beside a bed praying. I'm not sure if people really were living in the beehive house at this time, given that already it was a tourist attraction, or if his presence here is more symbolic. The Spirit tells Spencer to eavesdrop on Maxwell's prayer, which doesn't seem super holy to me, but whatever. Neil A. Maxwell is praying that God will let him endure all the awful things coming in the future without becoming bitter. It was confusing to go from seeing the debauchery of Tahiti's past to this sacred scene of suffering and righteous acceptance of the Lord's will. I now believe the stark contrast was to teach me how suffering could actually sanctify and bring about exaltation when the sufferer submits to Christ and lets that suffering purify and complete their mortal experience. I know that suffering is inevitable in life. There's no denying that fact. But I don't understand this desire so many religious people have to fetishize suffering. And I don't mean that in the SUL sense, but in the sense of turning suffering into an object of worship. Why? Wasn't the point of Jesus' death that he suffered so no one else would have to? I kind of feel like this attitude is spitting in Jesus' face. It's like Jesus is saying, I suffered and died for your sins. And Spencer is saying, that's okay, I'd rather do it myself. It's like, just take the win, buddy. It gets worse. I learned by all this that it is through suffering that mortals learn compassion and endurance and faithfulness, but that there has to also be a great willingness to be purified and uplifted in this way. I was seeing my own future in a way, too. I understood that I would also be called to suffer, so that I too could be purified, completed, and Christ-like when I left mortality, and I had to submit to this process willingly. That is what the angel meant when he told me, I will show you that which will surely come to pass. He was saying, you will suffer, and you will successfully submit and thereby be purified. I literally don't know what this means. How does suffering purify anything? I keep coming back to this use of the word purify. I even looked up the definition. To make pure, to clear from material defilement or imperfection, to free from guilt or moral or ceremonial blemish, to free from undesirable elements. What does that have to do with suffering? And then I remembered a line from an interview with Jody Hildebrandt's Nibbling. That's just a gender non-specific word for niece or nephew, in which they said Jody would tell them that she was trying to make them so uncomfortable that it would drive the sin out of them. Is that what the author meant by purify here? We aren't going to get the demons and evil spirits for a few more chapters, but I think we're seeing the origins of this idea. The scene before Spencer changes just enough so that he knows it's a different evening, although Neil A. Maxwell is still praying next to the bed. Now, however, he's praying for Spencer. This time I was astonished to realize that he was pleading for me, in my behalf, and for what I was going to be going through. He was speaking in the same fashion as before, but pleading this time for me. He was weeping. Both of these prayers were long, protracted, and beautiful pleadings with Father. His words overwhelmed me. This is one of those passages that makes it impossible for me to think of Spencer as humble. He's so special and wonderful that an apostle is down on his knees, bawling, begging God not to make Spencer suffer. Which also seems to contradict the last excerpt I read. If suffering makes people like Jesus and purifies them, wouldn't the apostle want Spencer to suffer? That's the real issue I have with people depicting suffering as desirable. If suffering is desirable, then it's desirable to make people suffer. And that opens the door to doing terrible things to other people in the name of making them Christ-like. Obviously, that's a message that some people have taken from this book. Spencer then notices the spirit of the then prophet, Howard W. Hunter, has entered the room with them. He's clearly in spirit form, though, not physical form like Neil A. Maxwell. He tells Spencer that he's died, and he's looking forward to seeing Spencer's grandparents in the afterlife. Not his own grandparents, Spencer's grandparents. Because Spencer is so important, and so is everyone related to him. Then the prophet leaves, and Spencer is handed a triple combination with a green cover by a guard in the hallway. The author writes that Spencer had never seen a triple combination with a green cover before, but the next Christmas, his wife Lynn gave him one, so he must have been seeing the future. But also, none of this is predicting the future, and it's all just the sorts of things that might happen. Sure. After this interaction with the prophet and the security guard, Spencer returns to his body, and it's even more painful than last time. It took about 3 days for my body to regain some strength. I joined my wife and family on vacation, but moved slowly and rested often for the several weeks of our trip until it was time to return home. See, this grinds my gears. He keeps presenting these physical experiences as extraordinary, but they're par for the course when you're living with ME, and it infuriates me that he won't admit that. At first, I thought that the author didn't say that Spencer had ME because he was afraid that admitting Spencer had an illness that was, at that time, considered psychological would discredit him. But I'm starting to think that he deliberately decided to omit Spencer's condition because he wanted to present these medical episodes as extraordinary and unusual. There are people with ME whose days consist of waking up, using the portable toilet next to the bed, drinking a meal replacement shake, and going back to sleep. And they do that for weeks or months or years on end. For Spencer to not feel well for 3 days and then have to rest frequently during his weeks-long Tahitian vacation is an absolute success story, and he's claiming it was a near-death experience. And I'm not saying that Spencer's life with ME wasn't tough. It's my personal belief that all suffering deserves relief, regardless of whom or how much or how little. But I do feel like the author has obscured the cause of Spencer's illness in order to manipulate the reader, and I don't like that. Not one bit. While we were still in Tahiti, we heard word that the prophet had passed away on the night that I had been out of my body and had seen the vision of him. This caused me to ponder over and over what I had experienced in the vision, if it was really him or just a vision. The author is talking out of both sides of his mouth again. Sure, the vision wasn't meant to be taken literally and wasn't a prediction of the future, but also Spencer literally interacted with the ghost of President Hunter and knew psychically that he had died. And I have to point out, and I mean no disrespect to President Hunter here, it wasn't a shock that he died. He was 87 years old, and he had metastatic prostate cancer that had already spread to his bones. The author even says earlier in the chapter that the last time Spencer saw President Hunter, he was in a wheelchair and frail and appeared not to have much time left on Earth. There's a pretty good chance that Spencer knew when he left for Tahiti that he was unlikely to see the prophet in the flesh again, so I don't know how convincing this is as evidence of Spencer's psychic ability. That's some pretty low-hanging fruit in the predictions department. And I feel the same way about Julie Rowe predicting earthquakes. Wait around long enough, and there will be an earthquake. That's not evidence of psychic abilities. That's just the nature of living on a planet with tectonic plates. After their vacation ends, Spencer and Lynn fly back to Utah, and Spencer goes to see his cardiologist, who tells him he has a heart valve that isn't working properly. He wants to put a pig heart valve in, but Spencer says no, and since then he's made a miraculous recovery. Again, having organs that malfunction for a time and then get better is common with ME. Body parts just seem to want to act up for a while. Spencer was right to skip the pig valve, though, because major interventions often lead to major complications. Thus ends Chapter 2. Chapter 3, Vision of the Savior. We're only in the 3rd chapter, and we've already gone through 2 of Spencer's 3 near-death experiences. But have no fear, because it seemed to me that following these near-death experiences, the angels left the doors to heaven ajar. I began to see many things of the Spirit. I did not think I was anything unique that I should have visions or prophetic dreams, yet they came to me often after these earlier struggles, and they still do. Statements like this are starting to read like false modesty instead of modesty, in my opinion. I'm not special. I just have apostles sobbing while praying for me and the prophet himself appearing to me after death, and I've died and come back 3 times. No, it doesn't sound singular at all. Then we segue into what is either an editing error or an outright lie. The following vision is the first one I experienced without having to die. In the foreword, John Pontius says that Spencer started having visions in his early 20s. Spencer was in his mid-40s when he went to Tahiti. Plus, I don't want to go back and dig through that first chapter, but there was at least one reference to something he'd learned in a previous vision, and the 2nd chapter includes the contents of a vision he had while giving a priesthood blessing to a woman. If these visions differ from each other in some way, the author doesn't make that clear. It's obvious that the author is attempting to present these experiences as extraordinary and connected to Spencer's NDE, and he's already lying by omission about the true nature of Spencer's illness, and also about his PhD for some reason, so I don't think it's far-fetched to believe that he lied here in order to make that first NDE appear more life-altering. Also, Spencer happened to be asleep when he had this vision, but it wasn't a dream. It couldn't possibly be a dream, especially not a classic running late dream. I was late for a leadership meeting and was therefore rushing into the building. Hilarious. It's hilarious. In the dream, or vision, Spencer is running across the parking lot toward his stake center because he's late for a meeting. And who does he meet? Just about the last person you'd expect to meet in a parking lot. I was halfway up the walk on the backside of the church when I heard, "Spencer." The voice was familiar to me, and I turned around to see who had spoken my name. I was astonished to see Jesus Christ standing in the parking lot where the sidewalk begins. Frankly, the fact that Jesus is shouting for Spencer across a parking lot makes me more certain that this was a dream. Jesus doesn't hang out in parking lots. He's not a 14-year-old skater boy. The next few paragraphs are gushing descriptions of what it's like to meet Jesus, which feels appropriate to the subject matter, and I think the author does a nice job here. I'll read a little of it. It felt to my soul as if I was seeing my most beloved friend for the first time after decades of absence. I felt my heart racing in my chest. He did not introduce himself because I recognized him immediately. He communicated with me verbally, but every word he spoke was rich with nonverbal truth that entered my soul far faster than words. Not sure what that last bit about nonverbal truth meant, but otherwise it's all right. The first appearance of Jesus ought to be a big, important moment in a book, right? And I like the emphasis on love. I think Pontius did well here. Jesus is wearing red robes, which, if you aren't familiar with apocalyptic depictions of Jesus, indicate that he's here for the second coming. It's a little dog whistle to the Doomsday Preppers. Then the author gives us a physical description of Jesus, and it's exactly what you would expect from someone who couldn't care less about historical accuracy. He was tall, possibly a little over 6 feet. His form was masculine. He had a sturdy build with big shoulders and strong limbs. His face was not thin, as is depicted in some paintings, but full, with high cheekbones. He had a dark beard that was closely trimmed. His hair was the color of his beard and was long enough to touch his shoulders. His eyes were the most beautiful and clearest blue one can imagine. It probably won't surprise you to learn that, in addition to bad fiction, I love bad movies. Just the other day, I was watching the Riff Tracks version of a 1979 Italian movie called The Visitor, which is about an evil little girl with telekinesis, whose mother has the unique ability to give birth to the Antichrist. And at the end, John Huston takes the evil little girl in a spaceship to live with Jesus and a bunch of other bald children in some kind of space atrium, I think. One of the things that makes this movie so delightfully awful is that it never attempts to explain any of this. Anyway, as soon as I saw Jesus in this movie, I thought, that's the Visions of Glory Jesus, the one Chad and Lori saw. Granted, the visitor Jesus is wearing a dreadful blonde wig, but a lot of American Christians picture Jesus as blonde. Lauren Matthias calls this version Surfer Jesus, but he'll always be Space Jesus to me. If you watch The Visitor, I think it's free on Peacock right now. I recommend against doing so sober. I guess what's happening here is people are pasting their masculine fantasies onto Jesus. What does it say about modern Americans that they're so determined to make Jesus hot? Is it our superficiality, our cocophobia, our lookism? Historians estimate the real Jesus was between 5'1" and 5'5". He was a short king, but the Visions of Glory author puts him over 6 feet. Broad shoulders, sturdy build, a full face with high cheekbones, blue eyes. He sounds like Chris Hemsworth. Nobody knows what Jesus looked like. The earliest depictions of Jesus describe him as short, ugly, red-faced, and possibly a hunchback. One description specified that he had a unibrow. Sometimes his hair is curly, sometimes it's lank. At least one person claimed he was bald. We don't know. That's what it comes down to. We don't know, and I'm not really sure why everyone is so concerned. But I guess that when you can't stop drawing parallels between yourself and Jesus, you're more inclined to make Jesus a tall, hot, buff, white guy than a short, brown-skinned, red-faced, freckled, bald hunchback with a unibrow. Because that's humility. Spencer throws down his briefcase and rushes forward to hug Jesus. And I guess Jesus picks him up, because the author says Spencer can't figure out how Jesus is managing to hold Spencer, even though Jesus is technically floating several inches above ground. Then Jesus compliments Spencer, which is reminiscent of how Jesus behaved in Chad Daybell novels. He looked me in the eye and told me he was pleased with my life thus far. He thanked me earnestly for my service in his name. He told me that he loved me, and that from this time forward I would do much good for the kingdom. He paused for a second, then added that the righteous desire of my heart would be granted. I knew exactly which desire he meant. It was my great desire that I truly would rise to endure my future trials well, and thereby be purified. There's an underlying assumption here that Spencer is going to suffer horribly, and I guess he feels that he has to suffer in order to be purified, and that's why his most fervent wish isn't to just avoid suffering. Jesus then tells Spencer that he really needs to get to that meeting, and they part ways. Spencer wakes from his vision, sobs with joy, and writes it all down. To really know that he lives, that he is a perfect, benevolent friend who loves me enough to leave the heavens, come to earth, and take the time to embrace me, to have a relationship with me, and with all of us who seek him. This is the sweetest knowledge I have ever known. To know that he knows you far better than you know yourself, and yet he loves you better still, and is willing to show you who you are in his sight and what you are capable of. This is why I love him so, because he loved me first. See, that's nice. That's relatable. We all want to feel seen and known and loved for who we are. It's a little transactional, especially toward the end, but it's emphasizing love and connection, and I like that. Unfortunately, this section is immediately followed by a miserable meditation on the fall. Trigger warning for disability issues and poorly chosen analogies. Our hearts and our minds are clouded and impaired, handicapped by the fall. We are spiritual, special needs people, quite literally disabled in every possible way. We are, in God's view, a mortal child who was born blind, mentally impaired, and paralyzed. It's just tacky, you know? It's tacky and it's tasteless, and I would expect someone with a chronic illness to understand that. It's also another example of the author making spiritual issues physical. And this focus on the physical body continues. When we fell to mortality, we could no longer see existence as it truly is, full of spiritual beings on uncountable worlds. We fell from being intelligent enough to understand vast truths. We participated in the creation of worlds before we were born, but at the moment of birth, our greatest skill is the ability to suck. Before we became mortal, we could go to far distant places in the blink of an eye to serve God. Our backyard was the vast creations of God. But after birth, our greatest physical ability was to blink and swallow. We left God, able to see distant galaxies and gaze into the past and future. But after birth, we could hardly focus upon our mother's face. This sounds to me like it was written by someone who resents his physical limitations. The message is, I'm not just my puny body. I'm powerful. I'm wise. Don't let my small human body fool you. This section is followed by a paragraph about how God will restore us and will become God-like, transcending our physical limitations as we're reunited with God. In the next section, the author explains that Spencer didn't know how to share the great wisdom he had obtained with others. One of the hardest aspects of obtaining some vast knowledge, I have found, is having nobody to talk to about it, no way to express it, and no way to rejoice with another mortal. The author might mean exactly what he wrote here, but I can't help remembering Spencer's earlier ambitions to be famous and respected, and I'm wondering if that wasn't part of the impetus to tell other people. The author says that Spencer struggled to become the person Jesus had shown him he could be, and that his attempts to do so and to make sense of the visions had terrible results. But the author is cagey about exactly what this looked like. It's also unclear what vast wisdom it is that Spencer is trying to share. Oh, and there's a line on page 63 in which the author claims that Spencer has 3 advanced degrees, but there are only 2 listed on Tom Harrison's LinkedIn page, which again makes me feel like this is somehow a deliberate deception. Spencer's apostle friend, Neil A. Maxwell, finally told him to stop trying to interpret the visions. About 20 years later, my apostle friend finally cleared that up for me during a private meeting. He said, "Spencer, do not make the error of trying to read meaning into these experiences. Just accept them as they are. Don't try to put your interpretation on it. Keep your own logic out of it. It is what it is. When you try to interpret it, it will lead you down roads where you should not go. Keep the experience pure. Wait for the Lord to reveal the meaning of it to you. Wait for the Lord to give you the interpretation. Wait for the further light and knowledge the Lord still has to give to you so you can complete your mission." The second NDE was in 1995, and this conversation occurred 20 years later, so 2015? Somebody's definitely fudging the timeline, because Neil A. Maxwell died in 2004. Also, why didn't Spencer listen to Maxwell? Why didn't he keep the visions private? Was it because he couldn't resist sharing the vast wisdom? Was it because he still wanted to be famous? What would compel someone to disobey instructions from an apostle? I'm not LDS, so you'll have to tell me. The last section in this chapter is about Spencer's work with children, and it gets really weird really fast. First, the author says that Spencer's work with children who had been mistreated helped heal his own wounds from childhood. Okay, that seems alright. Then it says, I was bringing them to Christ, where all true healing occurs. Only Christ can heal these children, especially when they have been emotionally, sexually, or physically mistreated. So, children who aren't Christians just won't be allowed to heal? Ever? In a strange way, the author is undermining Spencer's entire profession here. And that's not completely shocking to me, because one of the things I've noticed in his podcast is that he is more anti-psychiatry than any therapist I have ever encountered. He goes off repeatedly. Entire episodes of this podcast are devoted to him just blathering about how psychiatry isn't all it's cracked up to be. It's very strange. But also this excerpt leads to the question, what's the point of therapy if only Jesus can help? What good are therapists? Well, therapists are only useful if they're also Christian psychics. And this is where this section goes off the rails. From that day onward, I could go into a room or sit on the stand in sacrament meeting, and I knew who in the audience had gone through those mistreatment experiences. No, you can't. That's a lie. The author is a liar. No one can look out at a crowd of people and psychically know who's had bad experiences. No one is omniscient. And I'm concerned because what if Spencer is wrong? What if he has a client come in, concludes they've been mistreated based on his psychic visions, and then chooses a treatment based off that erroneous assumption? I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer 2 weeks before I started college. Obviously, I was going through a lot. I was at this tiny liberal arts college that had exactly one therapist, and during the single session I had with her, she was fixated on my S-life and kept asking how my libido was. And I was just sitting there like, lady, I'm 700 miles from home. I just found out I have cancer, and I can't tilt my head back without cutting off my airway because of the stitches in my neck. My libido is not the problem. I was so upset afterward that I brought it up with my roommate and some friends at dinner, and everyone had a horror story about this therapist. She was notorious. She was an old school Freudian analyst, and all she wanted to talk about was S. She told one person, a good friend of mine, that she was romantically interested in her own father. Bad therapists can do real harm. This kind of behavior on Spencer's part is absolutely unethical. He's talking here about his work with children who've been mistreated and his ability to know what's happened to them. It is a wonderful but painful gift of the Spirit. I say it is painful because of this unusual capacity I gained to go with them to those dark and evil places in their hearts, and to retrieve them, snatch sometimes, or coax them with the help of Christ out of that darkness into the light. They experience a type of being born again. When an adult or child will submit to this process and allow me to act as Christ's agent in guiding them through this, they are healed of that completely and permanently, even as I was when I met the Savior that first time. There's a lot of metaphor here, but very little actual information. What does it mean when the author says that children have dark and evil places in their hearts? I don't know, but I don't like it. This description of Spencer's work makes it sound like he was doing spiritual work on the children, instead of treating them as a psychologist. What was he actually doing when he and Jesus snatched children out of the darkness? Was he rebirthing people in his office? Was he rebirthing children? This comment about the children being born again and snatched out of darkness really concerns me. The author continues to use the birth metaphor, but also starts comparing Spencer to Jesus again. There is a parallel to this healing I am blessed to undertake from time to time. Christ had to be spat upon and cruelly treated as an essential part of completing the atonement. He descended below all things so he could overcome all things. And when he overcame all things, then he was prepared to take us by the hand and lift us above all things. In a much smaller way, this is what I attempt to do with the children. I experienced the darkness of childhood mistreatment both in the womb and in life, and when Christ healed me, then I was enabled in some way I don't fully understand to be a part of healing the children. There's a pretty big difference in my mind between saying, I want to follow in Jesus' footsteps and become like him, and saying, I do what Jesus did. I saved these children the way Jesus saved me. Jesus said, do this in memory of me, not do this in mimicry of me. We get more of the birth metaphor here, but again, we don't hear what Spencer was actually doing with these children. Was it play therapy? Was it CBT? Because based on what's written here, it sounds like a cross between religious instruction and one of the Insidious movies. He's going into dark parallel dimensions armed only with Jesus and a flashlight to save the children. It's like an astral version of what Tim Ballard does. And I have to point this out. The author seems to be claiming that Spencer's mother's misgivings about keeping her ex-husband's baby amounted to deliberate mistreatment. No, I can't see the ABU word on YouTube without getting this video age restricted, which is absurd, but them's the rules. Having misgivings isn't mistreatment. Spencer's mother being unhappy and stressed out because her alcoholic ex abandoned her and her two small children isn't mistreating her fetus. Spencer seems to expect that pregnant people will be angelic and joyful and never allow a negative thought to spiritually blemish their child, no matter how difficult the circumstances. And apparently watching poor Lynn birth 5 children didn't temper that expectation. It's just ridiculous. The chapter ends with several long paragraphs about how the words Jesus speaks while on earth are layered with spiritual meaning, but you have to advance spiritually in order to understand the deeper layers of meaning. Basically, you can't comprehend them unless you're special. Thus ends chapter 3. Although I'm going to save my concluding questions for the last video in this series, I do want to share 2 random thoughts before I end this video. First, I want to talk about 2 chapters in the Doctrine and Covenants, an LDS scripture, that I think shed some light on this book and on some of what's going on in the Daybell cult sphere right now. The sections from D&C are 58 and 76. I've been thinking a lot about the title of this book, Visions of Glory, and what that means. What is glory in this context? It's essentially akin to honor, to prestige. It's a type of spiritual elevation. Verses 2 and 3 of D&C 58 read, For verily I say unto you, blessed is he that keepeth my commandments, whether in life or in death, and he that is faithful in tribulation, the reward of the same is greater in the kingdom of heaven. Ye cannot behold with your natural eyes, for the present time, the design of your God concerning those things which shall come hereafter, and the glory which shall follow after much tribulation. What these verses are saying is that glory comes to a person after they suffer tribulations, perhaps even times of tribulation, and remain faithful. So when the author talks about Spencer's suffering, I think what he's really saying is that by remaining faithful through his suffering, Spencer will achieve glory. Continuing with verse 4, For after much tribulation come the blessings. Wherefore the day cometh that ye shall be crowned with much glory. The hour is not yet, but is nigh at hand. Remember this, which I tell you before, that you may lay it to heart, and receive that which is to follow. Behold, verily I say unto you, for this cause I have sent you, that you might be obedient, and that your hearts might be prepared to bear testimony of the things which are to come. This makes it clear that the key is obedience. God is saying, stay faithful, stay obedient no matter what misery I throw at you, and Jesus will give you glory when he returns. Section 76 of D&C, however, actually explicates how glory will be doled out in heaven. There are 3 heavens in LDS theology, and each one has a different degree of glory. Section 76 is fascinating. It is, in itself, a recording of visions of glory. Basically, Joseph Smith and another fellow were shown the 3 heavens and hell, and the word glory appears 36 times in Section 76. That's more than 3 times as often as it appears in any other section of D&C. And yes, I actually sat and ran searches on every section of the Doctrine and Covenants in order to figure this out. Gosha and I sat down and did a plain text reading of Section 76 together, because we are a dorky couple who do things like that for fun, while keeping in mind the book's position that being alive is essentially a test of whether or not we can remain obedient and faithful in our suffering. I'm starting at verse 50 here. And again we bear record, for we saw and heard, and this is the testimony of the gospel of Christ concerning them who shall come forth in the resurrection of the just. They are they who received the testimony of Jesus, and believed on his name, and were baptized after the manner of his burial, being buried in the water in his name. And this according to the commandment which he has given, that by keeping the commandments they might be washed and cleansed from all their sins, and receive the Holy Spirit by the laying on of the hands of him who is ordained and sealed unto this power, and who overcome by faith, and are sealed by the Holy Spirit of promise, which the Father sheds forth upon all those who are just and true. They are they who are the church of the firstborn. I actually gasped aloud when we reached that line. This passage makes reference to the celestial kingdom, the best heaven with the most glory. The souls who end up there make up the church of the firstborn, which is what Chad Daybell claimed he was creating on earth. I think that one of the reasons underlying the author's decision not to talk about Spencer's secret health condition is that the cause of his suffering doesn't matter. All that matters is that Spencer doesn't lose faith or disobey. So the more he suffers, the worse the tribulations, the more evidence of his faithful obedience that he can provide. I keep thinking of Melanie Gibbs saying to Lori, "Why do you think all these terrible things keep happening to you?" And Lori replying, "It's because Satan just really hates me." This line of thinking sort of explains why Lori is so cemented in her delusions. And I think that's why she's fighting this Arizona case so hard. She knows she's going to be convicted, but she isn't trying to prove her innocence to a jury. She's trying to prove her faithfulness to God. She's staying the course, just like D&C 76 instructs her to do. Why does she keep trying to argue that she's being set up by the police? Because the police answer to Satan. She's remaining obedient in the face of Satan's fiery darts. Only she's confused God with her delusions, so she's staying faithful to the delusions. She's going to overcome by faith, and as long as she does that, the outcome of the legal case doesn't matter. It's pretty warped, but she does have a psychotic disorder. The other point I want to make is that, while I can't claim to know if any of this really happened or how Tom Harrison's health issues factored into his spiritual experiences and relationship to God, there is a foundation here to interpret this entire book as Spencer's attempt to come to terms with his illness. If you take a man who's extremely religious and has lived a life of privilege and success, and you give him an essentially untreatable disease, it isn't unfathomable that they would try to deal with the loss of that privilege by constructing a narrative in which his illness isn't just something bad that happened to him, but a series of sacred trials that will prove him a deserving member of the Church of the Firstborn. He'd rather be a holy warrior than a victim of bad luck. And honestly, who wouldn't? Even though I think that's wacky and not in keeping with reality, I can't deny that it would be nice to believe that all of this suffering is for something. That it's leading to accolades in heaven. That I'm not just enduring another migraine, but actually laughing in Satan's face. I can understand why someone, not me, but someone, might find that comforting. Because the truth is, most of us don't want to be victims. Lying on the couch all day gets old really fast. So if anyone out there is considering topics for an English dissertation and you want to do disability literary criticism, pick up a copy of Visions of Glory. Otherwise, this is just food for thought. That's all for this video. Next time, we'll get into Spencer's third near-death experience and watch the author rip off both Ghostbusters and A Christmas Carol. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Please don't reach out to anyone involved with this book. And remember to use your words wisely. Thanks. Where is the beginning of this chapter? What? Alright. Say the real word in the first 8 minutes of the video. I strongly suggest this chapter of Visions of Glory. That Spencer changed his life to egocentric. That was a really loud car. It causes brain fog and organists use. And the treatment, they were an enlightened and spirit-filled field. But it's now a fallen nation, bridling with sin. Did I just say bridling? I think I meant riddled. In the most awful manner they could devise. A type of things that would or even that would happen just this way. Say that Spencer had enemy be Spencer and Lynn fly black. And from this time forward, one of the hardest, oh wait, that's the wrong, yeah. Bad therapists who see SUL interests? No. To go with them. But you have to advance spiritually in order to understand the deeper laying your God concerning those things which will come. And I think that's why she's fighting. That's a loud plane. Excuse me. Not again, dear Lord.